In the forgotten corners of the Arizona desert, some grudges don't fade with time. They seep into the soil, poisoning everything they touch, waiting for a single spark to ignite a firestorm. This isn't a story from 100 years ago. This is the story of Narlin, a young Apache woman who served coffee with a quiet smile, unaware she was living on borrowed time. It's the story of Ben Carter, a lone rancher who thought his wars were over until a new one landed on his doorstep. It's a story about how a simple act of human decency in a dusty diner became a fight for survival against a family determined to bury a secret and anyone who stood in their way. What you are about to hear is a testament to the fact that the old, violent West is not dead. It's just sleeping. The heat in Verde Creek, Arizona, had a physical weight to it. It settled on your shoulders the moment you stepped out of the air conditioning. A dry, oppressive blanket that shimmered above the cracked asphalt of Route 188. For Ben Carter, it was just a fact of life, like the relentless sun or the fine layer of dust that covered his Ford F-150 no matter how often he washed it. At 67, Ben moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned long ago that rushing in this climate was a fool's errand. His ranch, a sprawling but tired-looking spread of 500 acres, was a good 20 miles out of town. It was his sanctuary and his prison, a place of profound silence that had soaked up the grief of losing his wife, Martha, a decade prior. He came into Verde Creek twice a week, once for supplies, and once for a Thursday lunch at the Copper Spoon Diner. It was a ritual as ingrained as the rising sun. The Copper Spoon was an institution, a relic of the 60s, with cracked red vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked since 2003. But the coffee was strong, and the burgers were honest. For the last 6 months, there was another reason Ben came. Her name was Narlin. She was young, maybe 22, with the kind of quiet grace that made her stand out in the loud, clattering diner. Her long black hair was usually tied back in a simple braid that fell to the small of her back. She had high cheekbones, characteristic of her Apache heritage, and dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing but betrayed little. She moved between tables with an efficiency that was almost silent, a stark contrast to the boisterous chatter of the other waitresses. Ben never said much to her beyond his order. The usual Narlin thank you. But he watched. He saw the way some of the local men looked at her, a mix of crude desire and simmering resentment. He saw the way she'd absorb a thinly veiled racist remark with a placid nod, her expression unchanging, though Ben noticed the slight tightening of her jaw. She was from the San Carlos reservation, trying to make a life for herself in town, and in a place like Verde Creek that was a quiet act of defiance. On this particular Thursday, the stillness felt different. It was heavy, charged. The bell above the diner door chimed, and the 3 Dalton brothers walked in. The Daltons were as much a part of Verde Creek's landscape as the saguaro cacti. They were a blight. Their family had run cattle in the area for 3 generations, and they carried themselves with the swagger of feudal lords. Ray the eldest was a thick, bull-necked man with pale, predatory eyes. His younger brothers, Hank and Cody, were his shadows, dimmer copies of his arrogance and cruelty. They took the booth in the corner, and the diner's ambient noise seemed to drop a few decibels. Ray's eyes found Narlin immediately. He didn't smile. He just stared as she approached their table notepad in hand. "What can I get for you boys?" she asked, her voice even. "Well now," Ray drawled, leaning back and letting his gaze sweep over her slowly, insultingly. "Look what the reservation dragged in. I'll have a steak rare, And bring me a beer, darling." He spat the last word like it was a foul taste in his mouth. Ben, sitting 2 booths away, felt a familiar cold knot tighten in his gut. It was the same feeling he'd gotten in the jungles of Vietnam, the premonition of violence. He gripped his coffee mug, his knuckles white. Narlin didn't flinch. "ID, please." Hank snickered. "He don't need no ID, we own half this county." "Diner policy," Narlin said, her voice flat. "No ID, no beer." Ray's eyes narrowed to slits. For a moment, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. He held her gaze, a silent battle of wills playing out over the sticky tabletop. Ben watched Ray's hand resting near his belt. Finally, a cruel smirk spread across Ray's face. He reached into his wallet and slammed his driver's license down. "There. You happy now, little squaw?" The slur hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Narlin simply picked up the license, glanced at it, and placed it back on the table. She wrote down their orders without another word and walked away towards the kitchen pass-through. Ben watched her go. He saw the slight tremble in her hands as she clipped the order ticket to the carousel. She thought no one was looking, but he saw. And in that moment, the quiet pact he'd made with himself to stay out of other people's trouble began to fray. He didn't know why the Daltons had their venom aimed at this specific young woman, but he recognized the look in Ray Dalton's eyes. It wasn't just disdain. It was something deeper, something possessive and dangerous. It was the look of a predator that had already marked its prey. He just hadn't started the hunt yet. When Ben paid his bill at the counter, Narlin gave him a small, tired smile. "Have a good day, Mr. Carter," she said. "You too, Narlin," he replied, his voice gruffer than he intended. He hesitated for a second, 1,000 things he could say, dying on his lips. "Be careful. Are you all right?" In the end, he just nodded and walked out the bell, chiming his departure. But as he drove his truck down the long, dusty road back to his ranch, he couldn't shake the image of her face or the chilling certainty that the storm for her was just beginning to gather. 2 days later, the first real crack of thunder sounded. Ben was mending a fence on the southern edge of his property, the part that bordered the scrubland leading towards the reservation. The work was hard, physical, and blessedly mindless. It kept his thoughts from straying to the diner, to the ugly scene with the Daltons. But the peace was shattered by the sight of a familiar beat-up sedan sputtering to a halt on the dirt access road about a 1/4 mile away. It was Narlin's Toyota. He watched as she got out, looked at her front tire, and kicked it gently in frustration. A plume of dust rose and settled around her. He saw her look around, her posture radiating a vulnerability that pulled at something deep inside him. This was no place to be stranded. He wiped his brow with the back of a gloved hand, tossed his tools into the truck bed, and drove towards her. As he got closer, he saw the problem. The tire wasn't just flat. The sidewall was slashed, a clean, deliberate cut. This was no random puncture. "Trouble?" he asked, pulling up beside her. His voice was calm, but his eyes were scanning the surrounding landscape, checking the ridges and hollows. Narlin jumped, startled. She hadn't heard his approach. "Mr. Carter." Yeah. Looks like I picked up a nail or something." Ben got out and walked over, crouching down to inspect the damage. "This wasn't a nail, Narlin." He ran a finger along the gash. "This was a knife." Her face paled. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection. "But who would do that?" she whispered, though Ben suspected she already knew the answer. "Let's not stand around here waiting to find out," he said, his tone shifting into something more authoritative. "You have a spare?" She nodded, looking shaken. Together they worked in near silence, the only sounds the clank of the tire iron and the groan of the jack. Ben did most of the heavy lifting, his movements sure and practiced. He was acutely aware of her standing nearby, watching him, her earlier composure completely gone, replaced by a raw fear. When the spare was on, he tossed the ruined tire into his truck bed. "I'll take this into town. Get it patched if it can. Canby, you shouldn't be driving on this donut for long." "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice small. "I know," he replied simply. "Follow me. I'll make sure you get home all right." He didn't make it a question. She just nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. She lived in a small rented bungalow on the outskirts of Verde Creek, a place that was more desert than town. Ben followed her all the way to her driveway, waiting until she was safely inside, and the door was locked before he turned his truck around. As he drove away, he saw a dusty pickup truck, one he recognized as belonging to the Daltons, parked half a block down, pulling away from the curb the moment he passed. They had been watching. The next Thursday, Ben went to the diner as usual. Narlin was there, but the light in her eyes had dimmed. She seemed to be walking on eggshells, constantly glancing at the door. She brought him his coffee and managed a weak smile. "Thank you again, Mr. Carter, for the tire. Don't mention it," he said, looking at her directly. "Narlin, has there been any more trouble?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "They were waiting for me after my shift Tuesday," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The Daltons just parked across the street. They didn't do anything, just watched me leave. I drove a different way home." Ben's jaw tightened. This was a classic intimidation tactic. Psychological warfare. "You should tell the sheriff." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Sheriff Brody. He's been playing poker with their father, Old Man Dalton, every Friday night for 20 years. He'll tell me they haven't broken any laws. He'll tell me I'm being oversensitive." She was right, and Ben knew it. Sheriff Frank Brody was a man who valued an easy life above all else. He wouldn't rock the Dalton boat unless he was forced to. The situation escalated a week later. Ben got a call on a Sunday morning. It was Narlin, her voice trembling with panic. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry to bother you. I didn't know who else to call." "What is it, Narlin? What's wrong?" "I went out to my car this morning, and there was a dead coyote on the hood. Its throat was... it was awful." Her voice broke. There was a note. Ben felt a surge of ice-cold fury. What did the note say? He could hear her take a ragged breath. It said, "Some things know when to leave. You should learn from them." "Stay inside. Lock your doors. I'm coming," he said, and hung up the phone. He was in Verde Creek in 15 minutes, his old truck eating up the miles. When he pulled up to her house, he saw it. The gruesome, pathetic display on the hood of her Toyota. It was a clear, brutal message. This was no longer about sideways glances in a diner. This was a direct threat. A line had been drawn in the dust, and the Daltons had just crossed it. He went to her door and knocked. She opened it a crack, her face ashen. He stepped inside her small, tidy living room. It was sparsely decorated, but clean, with a few photos on a small table. One of them was of an older Apache woman with a kind, wrinkled face. Her grandmother Ben presumed. They can't keep doing this, Nalin said, her fear now hardening into anger. But I don't know why I don't understand what they want from me. It's not you they want something from, Ben said, thinking aloud, the pieces starting to click together in his mind. It's something you have, or something they think you have. He looked at the photo of her grandmother. Nalin, when did your grandmother pass away? About 8 months ago. She answered, confused by the question. Did she leave you anything? In her will? Land maybe Nalin's brow furrowed. Just a small piece of land. It's north of here, bordering their ranch. Everyone says it's worthless. Just rock and creosote. She told me to hold on to it. She said the land remembers. Ben looked out the window, his gaze distant, staring at the heat rising from the pavement. The Daltons' ranch had been struggling. He'd heard the whispers in town. Their wells were running low. Water in Arizona wasn't just life. It was power. It was millions of dollars. Nalin, he said. Turning back to her, a grim understanding dawning on his face. I don't think your land is worthless at all. I think it has water, and I think the Daltons know it. The land didn't look like much. It was a 10-acre parcel of sun-scorched earth, studded with jagged rocks and thorny mesquite bushes that clung stubbornly to life. To the east, the vast overgrazed expanse of the Dalton Ranch stretched to the horizon. To the west, the terrain grew wilder, rising into the foothills of the mountains that marked the edge of the San Carlos reservation. It was exactly as Nalin had described it, worthless. But Ben Carter knew that in the desert, the greatest treasures are often hidden. He had convinced Nalin to show him the property. The drive out was tense and silent. She held a tattered, hand-drawn map her grandmother Elena had left her. It was less a map and more a sketch filled with symbols and notes in Apache. My grandmother. She was a tribal elder, Nalin explained as Ben's truck bounced along the rutted track. She knew things. Stories about the land that go back generations. She always said this place was special, sacred. The land remembers, Ben murmured, echoing her grandmother's words. He parked the truck near an old, gnarled cottonwood tree that served as a marker on the map. The air was still and hot. What are we looking for? Nalin asked, shielding her eyes from the glare. A sign, Ben said. Water doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just whispers. He began to walk the property line, his eyes not on the horizon, but on the ground. He was looking for clues a city dweller would never see: the type of vegetation, the subtle dips in the terrain, the color of the soil. The Daltons' land next door was parched, the ground cracked and pale. But here on Nalin's small plot, Ben noticed a faint but distinct line of deeper green in the brush. It was almost imperceptible, a trail of life snaking through the arid landscape. He followed it. Nalin walked behind him, her initial skepticism giving way to a hopeful curiosity. The line of green led them to a small, shallow arroyo, a dry wash that would fill with water during the monsoon rains. But this was the dry season. There should have been nothing here but sand and stone. Ben knelt down. He dug his hand into the sandy soil at the bottom of the wash. A few inches down, the sand was cool. A few inches more, and it was damp. He looked up at Nalin, his eyes glinting with discovery. Your grandmother was a wise woman, he said. He stood up and continued to follow the arroyo as it curved around a rocky outcrop. And then they saw it. Tucked into a hollow, hidden from the main road by a cluster of boulders and overgrown manzanita, was a small rock-lined pool of water. It wasn't large, maybe 10 feet across, but it was crystal clear and still. The surface was so placid it perfectly mirrored the brilliant blue of the Arizona sky. A seep spring bubbling up from deep within the earth. In this part of the world, it was the equivalent of a diamond mine. I never knew this was here. Narlin breathed, her voice filled with awe. She knelt by the water's edge, touching the surface with her fingertips, as if to confirm it was real. This spring feeds the aquifer. Ben explained, his mind racing. An aquifer that probably runs right under the Dalton property. Their wells are going dry because they're overdrawing their end. But the source is here, on your land. With legal rights to this spring, you control the water. The awe on Narlin's face was slowly replaced by a chilling understanding. So they weren't just trying to scare me away, she said. They want to steal this. They've been waiting maybe for years for my grandmother to pass on, thinking they could just take it from me. They thought you were just a scared girl, working at a diner, Ben said grimly. They figured they could bully you into selling for pennies, or just abandon the land altogether. They underestimated you, and they underestimated your grandmother. Narlin stood up, her jaw set with a new resolve. The fear that had haunted her for weeks was being burned away by a righteous fire. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about her family, her heritage, the legacy Elena had entrusted to her. What do we do? She asked, her voice steady. The first thing Ben said is to get this legally surveyed and registered with the county water board. We need an official record that this spring is on your property. We need to build a fortress of paperwork around it, so strong that not even the Daltons' money and influence can breach it. But as he spoke, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The distant crunch of tires on gravel coming from the direction of the Dalton ranch. A truck engine getting closer. "Get back!" he hissed, pulling Narlin behind the cluster of boulders. "Don't make a sound." They crouched in the shadows, their hearts pounding in unison. A dusty, mud-splattered pickup truck, the same one Ben had seen outside Narlin's house, rolled to a stop on the other side of the property line. The doors opened, and Ray and Cody Dalton got out. They carried rifles held casually, but ready. They didn't cross onto Narlin's land. They just stood there, staring, their eyes scanning the terrain. Ray raised a pair of binoculars and swept them across the small parcel, his gaze lingering on the arroyo, on the dense patch of green. He couldn't see the spring itself from his vantage point, but Ben knew he was looking for the signs just as Ben had. "Ain't nothing out here," Cody whined, kicking at a rock. "I told you, Ray, the old witch was just crazy. Shut up, Cody." Ray snarled, not lowering the binoculars. "She wasn't crazy. The water's here. I can smell it." His gaze stopped fixed on the spot where Ben's truck was parked near the cottonwood tree. "And it looks like we ain't the only ones who came looking for it today." He lowered the binoculars, a slow, venomous smile spreading across his face. He looked directly towards the rocks where Ben and Narlin were hiding. He couldn't have seen them, but he knew. He knew they were there. He raised his rifle not to his shoulder, but just high enough to be a clear threat. "This is private land," he shouted into the silence, his voice echoing in the heat. "And we don't take kindly to trespassers." He then turned, got back into his truck, and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating sense of menace in his wake. Ben and Narlin stayed hidden for a long time after the truck was gone. The beautiful secret spring no longer felt like a gift. It felt like a target. "They know," Narlin whispered, her voice trembling again. They know we know. Yes, Ben said, helping her to her feet. They do. And that means the game has changed. They won't be leaving dead animals on your car anymore. From now on, they'll be coming for you. The drive back from the spring was a world away from the drive out. The silence was no longer tense. It was thick with a shared, unspoken dread. The secret was out, not just the secret of the water, but the secret of its discovery. The Daltons were no longer dealing with a phantom problem. They now had a face to attach to their frustration. 2 faces. When they reached Narlin's small bungalow, Ben didn't even slow down. "You're not staying here tonight," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "What, Mr. Carter?" "I can't just... You can and you will." He interrupted, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "That house is a fishbowl. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They'll be back. If not tonight, then tomorrow. And they won't be bringing notes." He saw the protest die on her lips, replaced by the grim acceptance of the truth. He drove past her street and headed out of Verde Creek back towards the long, lonely road that led to his ranch. "Where are we going?" she asked, though she already knew. "My place. It's isolated. It's defensible. You'll stay there until we can get to the county seat in Globe and file the paperwork for that spring." Narlin said nothing. She just stared out at the passing desert, the familiar landscape now looking alien and hostile. She was leaving her home, her life, and putting her safety in the hands of a man she barely knew. A quiet, solitary rancher who had, for reasons she couldn't fathom, decided to make her fight his own. Ben's ranch house was like the man himself, weathered solid and built to withstand the elements. It was a single-story adobe structure with a wide, covered porch set on a slight rise that gave a commanding view of the surrounding land. As they pulled up, his old dog, a blue heeler mix named Dusty, trotted out to greet the truck, tail wagging. "It's not much," Ben said, "killing the engine." "It's safe," Narlin replied, and Ben knew she understood. He set her up in the guest room, a room that hadn't been used since Martha's sister had visited for the funeral. It was clean, but stark, holding the faint, sad scent of disuse. As Narlin placed her small overnight bag on the bed, the reality of her situation seemed to crash down on her. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a refugee. Ben gave her space, retreating to the kitchen to make coffee. He moved with a renewed purpose, the lethargy of his solitary life burned away by the adrenaline of the looming conflict. He checked the locks on the doors, the latches on the windows. He pulled his old hunting rifle, a Winchester Model 70, from its case, checking the action and the ammunition. It was a muscle memory, from a lifetime ago, from a different kind of war. But the feeling was unnervingly the same, the quiet, methodical preparation for violence. The next morning they made a plan. The county records office in Globe was a 2-hour drive. They couldn't just go. The Daltons would be watching the roads. They'd have to assume any trip into town was a potential ambush. "First we call for backup," Ben said, picking up his landline phone. He dialed the number for the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. He got a bored-sounding dispatcher who listened to his story with practiced indifference. "So you're saying the Dalton brothers looked at you?" The dispatcher asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. "I'm saying they are engaged in a campaign of intimidation and harassment that has escalated to direct threats," Ben said, keeping his voice level. "I'm saying they left a dead animal and a threatening note on this young woman's property. We need a deputy to escort us to Globe." There was a long pause. "Sir, unless a direct physical assault has occurred, there's not much we can do. The Daltons have a right to drive on public roads. If you have evidence of a specific crime, You can come in and file a report with Sheriff Brody." Ben hung up the phone, his jaw tight. "Just as you said. Useless." Narlin, who had been listening, nodded grimly. "So we're on our own." "Looks that way," Ben said. His eyes drifted to the window, scanning the long dirt road that led to his gate. "For now, this ranch is the only law that matters." The next 2 days were a strange, suspended reality. A siege under a brilliant blue sky. Ben taught Narlin how to handle the Winchester. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp. She was a fast learner. They took turns on watch, scanning the horizon from the porch with a pair of powerful binoculars. The silence of the ranch was no longer peaceful. It was a canvas on which they painted their fears. Every gust of wind in the mesquite, every cry of a distant hawk, sounded like an approaching engine. On the 3rd night, it happened. Dusty, sleeping at the foot of Ben's bed, suddenly let out a low, guttural growl. Ben was awake in an instant. He grabbed the rifle and moved silently to the living room window, peering through a crack in the blinds. Under the cold, bright light of a nearly full moon, he saw them. 2 sets of headlights moving without sound, crawling up his access road. They'd cut their engines and were coasting the last half-mile. "They're here," he said, his voice a low whisper. Narlin was already there, her face pale in the moonlight, but her eyes wide and alert. She was holding a heavy iron skillet from the kitchen, her only weapon. "What do they want?" she breathed. "To scare us. To burn us out. To end this before it gets to a courtroom," Ben said. He watched as the 2 trucks, Dalton vehicles, stopped just outside his main gate. Figures emerged, dark shapes in the moonlight. 4 of them. The 3 brothers and Ben guessed one of their ranch hands. "Stay away from the windows," he commanded, pulling Narlin back into the center of the room. He flicked a switch, and the powerful floodlights he'd installed on the corners of the house blazed to life, bathing the entire front yard in stark white light. The figures at the gate froze, caught like deer in the headlights. Ben slid open a small window on the side of the house, away from the direct line of sight. He pointed the Winchester's barrel into the night sky and fired one deafening shot. The crack echoed across the valley, a clear and unambiguous statement. "We are here. We are armed. We are waiting." From the gate he heard Ray Dalton's enraged shout. "Carter! You old fool, you can't hide in there forever. That girl and that land belong to us." Ben didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He and Narlin stood in the center of the brightly lit house, a tiny island of defiance in a vast, dark sea of malice. The fortress was holding, but for how long the Daltons had retreated, for now peeling away into the darkness. But this was just the first assault. They knew now that Ben Carter wasn't just some nosy old man. He was a combatant at heart, and he had just declared war. The gunshot had bought them a reprieve, but both Ben and Narlin knew it was temporary. The Daltons were not men who backed down from a challenge. They were men who doubled down. The night was far from over. Sleep was an impossible luxury. They sat in the dim light of the kitchen, sipping coffee that had long gone cold, their senses stretched to a breaking point. "They'll try something else," Narlin said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Something quieter. "They'll try to separate us." Ben predicted, his gaze fixed on the dark window. "Or draw me out." He was right. Around 2 a.m., Dusty started growling again, a low, sustained rumble from the back of the house. Ben motioned for Narlin to stay put. He crept through the dark hallway, his bare feet making no sound on the cool tile floor. He peered through the kitchen window, which looked out over his back pasture and towards the old wooden barn. He saw it immediately. A flicker of orange dancing against the dark silhouette of the barn. Fire. Damn them, he breathed. It was the classic diversion. They'd set his barn ablaze, hoping he'd run out, panicked to save his equipment, or the structure itself, leaving Nalin alone and the house vulnerable. For a split second his heart seized. The barn held decades of his life. Martha's old gardening tools, his father's workbench, the tractor he'd spent a month's earnings on. But it was just wood and steel. The life he was protecting was inside the house. He returned to the living room. "They've set the barn on fire," he told Nalin. His voice tight with controlled rage. Her eyes widened in horror. "Oh, Ben. It's just a building." He cut her off, his tone firm. "It's what they want. They're waiting for me to go out there. We're staying put." They watched from the windows as the flames grew a sickening orange beacon in the vast darkness. The fire was a ravenous beast, consuming the old, dry timber with terrifying speed. The smell of smoke began to drift towards the house. The sight was hypnotizing, a funeral pyre for a part of his past. He could feel the Daltons out there in the dark, watching, waiting for him to break. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But the Daltons had a backup plan. From the front of the house came a new sound, the splintering crash of wood, followed by the metallic screech of his front gate being torn from its hinges. Ben spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. One of the trucks was ramming the gate, clearing a path to the house itself. This was it, the direct assault. Nalin, the bedroom, now he ordered. He pointed to the guest room at the far end of the hall. "Barricade the door. Don't come out. No matter what you hear." "I'm not leaving you," she protested, her eyes flashing with defiance. "You'll be more help to me if you're safe, and they have to get through two of us. Go." She hesitated, then nodded, grabbing the heavy iron skillet again before running down the hall. Ben heard the sound of a dresser being dragged across the floor. He turned back to the front window. The truck, a heavy-duty Ram with a reinforced grille, was now inside his perimeter. It was making a slow, menacing circle in the yard, its headlights sweeping across the front of the house, trying to find a weak point, trying to intimidate him. The other truck remained in the distance, its lights off. Ben knew he couldn't let them get close enough to ram the house itself. The adobe was thick, but it wouldn't withstand that kind of impact. He had to disable the vehicle. He moved to the side of the house, to the same window he'd fired the warning shot from. It gave him an angle on the truck's path. He rested the Winchester on the sill, took a deep, steadying breath, and waited. The skills he hadn't used in nearly 50 years came back with terrifying clarity. Control your breathing. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull. Lead the target. The truck made its pass. As the front of the vehicle came into his sights, he aimed low for the engine block. But in the split second before he fired, the passenger door flew open and Hank Dalton leaned out, firing a shotgun wildly at the house. Pellets peppered the adobe wall near the window, sending chips of stucco flying. Ben flinched back instinctively. The truck roared past, turning for another run. They were flushing him out, forcing him to keep his head down. He was pinned. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos. The shattering of glass from the back of the house, followed by a woman's scream of rage. Ben's blood ran cold. Nalin. He raced down the hall. The bedroom door was still barricaded, but the window was smashed. Cody Dalton was halfway through, trying to climb inside his face, a mask of ugly triumph. But Nalin was not cowering in a corner. She met him at the window, swinging the heavy cast-iron skillet with all her might. The skillet connected with the side of Cody's head with a sickening thud. He grunted in pain and surprise, his grip on the window frame faltering. Before he could recover, Narlin swung again, this time catching him square in the shoulder. He howled and fell backward, tumbling out of the window and onto the ground, outsum. Ben didn't hesitate. He saw his opening. With the Daltons' attention divided, he ran back to his post. The truck was beginning its next pass. This time he didn't wait. He lined up the shot, his target clear the front right tire. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The report of the shot was followed instantly by the explosive bang of the tire blowing out. The heavy truck swerved violently, its steering gone. Ray behind the wheel fought for control, but the vehicle veered sharply and plowed headfirst into a sturdy old oak tree at the edge of the yard with a gut-wrenching crunch of metal. Silence descended, broken only by the hiss of a ruptured radiator and the distant angry crackle of the burning barn. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the passenger door of the crashed truck creaked open, and Hank stumbled out, dazed. Ray was slumped over the steering wheel. From the back of the house, Ben could hear Cody groaning in pain. From the darkness beyond the fence, the second truck's engine roared to life. It sped forward, not to attack, but to rescue. It screeched to a halt beside the crash. Hank and the ranch hand scrambled to pull a groggy Ray from the driver's seat, while Cody limped towards them from around the house. They bundled themselves into the remaining vehicle, and with a spray of gravel sped away into the night, leaving the crippled truck and the burning barn behind them. Ben stood in the middle of his living room, the rifle still in his hands, his body shaking with adrenaline. Narlin emerged from the bedroom, her face smudged with dirt, the skillet still gripped in her hand. They had survived. They had won the battle. But the house was damaged, the ranch was scarred, and the air was thick with the promise of more violence. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of the real war. They looked at each other in the flickering, hellish light of the fire, two solitary people from different worlds now bound together by the blood and smoke of a single terrible night. The dawn broke over a scene of devastation. The barn was a smoldering, blackened skeleton. The yard was scarred with tire tracks and littered with shattered glass. A dead pickup truck was wrapped around one of Ben's oldest oak trees. The air hung heavy with the acrid smell of burnt wood and stale fear. But they were alive, and they were angry. The assault had changed something in both of them. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of the stomach, but it was now overlaid with a hard, defiant resolve. The Daltons had tried to break them with brute force, and they had failed. Now it was their turn to fight back, not with guns and fire, but with something far more powerful, the truth. They left their truck, Narlin said, staring at the wreckage from the porch. That's evidence. Sheriff Brody can't ignore this. He'll call it a dispute between neighbors. Ben said, his voice weary but firm. Ray will claim I shot at him first. It'll be our word against theirs, and their roots in this county run deeper than ours. No, the law is too slow, too weak. We need a weapon they can't fight. We need to go to Globe. Today. The plan was desperate, reckless. The Daltons would assume they were trapped, licking their wounds. They wouldn't expect them to go on the offensive so soon. It was their only advantage. They took Ben's truck. Narlin's car was still at her house, a sitting duck. They didn't take the main highway. Ben navigated a series of winding, unpaved back roads, his knowledge of the local geography their shield. Every plume of dust in the rearview mirror was a potential threat, every passing truck a cause for alarm. The 2-hour drive felt like an eternity. When they finally reached the city of Globe, the noisy, bustling streets felt like another planet compared to the silence of the ranch. Their destination was the Gila County Courthouse, a formidable stone building that seemed to exude an aura of unassailable authority. It was here they would forge their weapon. They split up. Narlin went to the Water Resources Department with her grandmother's will and the hand-drawn map. Her job was to file an official claim for the spring, to get a surveyor dispatched to start the slow, grinding process of making her ownership legally ironclad. Ben went to the office of the county recorder. He had a different goal, a hunch born from a lifetime of watching how power and land worked in the West. He wanted to look at the history of the Dalton Ranch itself. The records room was a quiet, musty place filled with the smell of old paper and bookbinding glue. A clerk, a woman named Maria with kind eyes and a patient demeanor, helped him navigate the archaic system of ledgers and microfiche. He started with the current Dalton deed and began to work backward generation by generation. For hours he scrolled through faded, spidery handwriting and blurry typescript. He traced the ownership of the Dalton land back from Ray to his father to his grandfather, a man named Jedediah Dalton, who had first acquired the vast property in 1908. And that's where he found it. The 1908 deed wasn't a sale. It was a land transfer signed by a federal agent from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The reason for the transfer was listed as abandonment. The previous registered owner of the parcel was a single Apache family. The family name listed on the document made the hair on Ben's arms stand up, Dile. He searched the name, cross-referencing it with other records. It was an older, more traditional spelling. The modern anglicized version was often simply Delhe. He remembered seeing it somewhere recently. He frantically searched his memory, the image of Narlin's small, tidy living room flashing in his mind, the photographs on her side table, the one of her grandmother, Elena. And next to it, a much older, sepia-toned photograph of a stern-looking Apache man and woman. On the frame was a small engraved plaque. He could picture it perfectly. Chief Thomas and Anya Delhe, Narlin's great-grandparents. His heart pounded. He pulled another set of records, Bureau of Indian Affairs census data, from the early 1900s. He found the entry for Thomas and Anya Delhe. It listed their children, one of whom was a daughter named Elena, Narlin's grandmother. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The Daltons hadn't just built their ranch next to Apache land. They had built it on stolen Apache land. He dug deeper. The term abandonment was a common legal fiction used at the time. He found letters in the archives correspondence between the bureau agent and Jedediah Dalton. Jedediah had been complaining for months about the Delhe family, accusing them of trespassing on his adjacent and much smaller plot of spooking his cattle. The agent in a final letter noted that he was relocating the troublesome family to the main San Carlos reservation for their own safety and the maintenance of public order. There had been no abandonment. It was a forced removal, a land grab, sanitized with bureaucratic language and institutionalized racism. Jedediah Dalton had coveted the land because it had the best grazing, and Ben now realized the most reliable access to the water table. He had used his influence and the prevailing prejudice of the era to simply take it. The Daltons' entire legacy, their wealth, their power, their identity as pioneering ranchers was built on a lie. A ghost in the deed. And the spring, the source of the entire conflict, wasn't just on a neighboring parcel that Narlin happened to inherit. The small 10-acre plot her grandmother had managed to hold on to was the only piece of their original vast ancestral lands that hadn't been stolen. Elena had held on to it not because it was valuable, but because it was all that was left. It was a living reminder of the injustice her family had suffered. The land remembers. Ben felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. This fight was no longer about protecting a young woman from a few greedy bullies. It was about correcting a wrong that was over a century old. He gathered copies of every document, the fraudulent deed, the letters, the census records. He now held a weapon far more devastating than his Winchester. He held the Dalton family's original sin committed to paper and preserved in the archives. He met Narlin in the courthouse lobby. She looked exhausted but triumphant. "The claim is filed," she said. "They're sending a surveyor out next week. It's officially in dispute, which means the Daltons can't touch it." Ben looked at her, then at the thick manila envelope in his hands. "They're not just going to lose the spring," he said, his voice low and intense. "They're going to lose everything." He opened the envelope and showed her the first document, the 1908 deed bearing her family's name. She stared at it, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. But these were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of profound, earth-shattering revelation. The ghost that had haunted her family for generations had just been given a name. And now they were going to make it scream. The final confrontation happened not at high noon, but in the stale, air-conditioned quiet of Sheriff Frank Brody's office. Ben and Narlin didn't ask for a meeting. They demanded one. Brody was already listening to Ray Dalton, whose arm was in a sling, give a perjured account of the previous night's events. And then the old man just opened fire on us for no reason, Ray was saying. "He's crazy." Frank Ben walked to the desk and calmly laid out his evidence photos, Narlin's affidavit, and finally, the 1908 land deed. "This isn't a civil dispute," Frank Ben said, his voice cold. "This is a century-long felony." Brody's eyes scanned the old document. Ray leaned over, his smirk dissolving as he read the names Jedediah Dalton, Thomas, and Anya Delhay. "What is this junk?" Ray blustered, but the confidence had left his voice. "That's the founding document of your family's fortune." Narlin said, her voice cutting through the room. "It's the record of how your great-grandfather stole my great-grandparents' land with the help of a corrupt federal agent. The land you've been trying to kill me for." Ben added the supporting documents, letters, and census records, laying them out like a winning hand. The color drained from Sheriff Brody's face. This was no longer a local squabble. It was a meticulously documented federal crime, a political firestorm he couldn't contain. Ray Dalton shrank in his chair, his bravado shattered. The truth was a weapon he had no defense against. The aftermath was decisive. Faced with irrefutable evidence and a looming federal investigation, the Dalton family capitulated. They were forced to cede the 10-acre plot with the spring, plus an additional 100 acres back to Narlin as a settlement. Ray Dalton pleaded guilty to lesser charges, and his family's name was forever tarnished in the county. Months later, Ben Carter sat on his porch at sunset. The new barn was nearly finished. He heard footsteps and turned to see Naylin walking up the path, not as a refugee, but as a friend. She had quit her job and was now partnering with other tribal members to start a sustainable farming cooperative on her ancestral land. She handed him a cold beer and sat in the chair beside him, the one that had been Martha's. "My grandmother would have liked you," Narlin said softly. Ben took a slow sip. "I think I would have liked her too." The silence on his ranch was no longer one of grief, but of a peace that was hard-won and deeply cherished. In the fight for a stranger's life, he had found a new dawn. The story of Narlin and Ben Carter is a powerful reminder that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. It shows that the fight for justice doesn't always end in a blaze of glory, but often in the quiet, undeniable power of the truth. They stood against a legacy of hatred and greed, armed with little more than decency and determination, and they proved that one person or two can make a stand and change the course of history, even if it's just in one small, forgotten corner of the world. If their story of resilience and the fight for what's right moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story of hope and courage. And most importantly, if you want to hear more true dramas and incredible stories of the human spirit, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for listening.